Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I first met our guest years ago when we were both involved in the local scouting movement. In the last 10 years, he has pursued a career as an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces. With postings in New Brunswick, Ontario, Ukraine, and now Turkey, he continues to take advantage of learning opportunities in the military, as well as the community groups he has chosen to get involved in. As you'll hear, this is a man passionate about integrating both. Here is our conversation with Alex Landry, recorded from his home in Izmir, Turkey, in late February 2022. Alex, welcome to the program.
It's such a pleasure to be here and really be partaking in such an endeavor at this time.
What I'd like to do during the course of the next little bit is talk about your passion for the military and for community involvement and how the two of them might work together. At the same time, I'd like to get you to give us some insight into what you do. And despite the fact that Kingston does host a large military base, there are still many of us here who have a very limited knowledge as to what an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces might do during the course of their workday. So hopefully we'll get a little education in here. And what I'd like to do is start with this. So you and I first met when we were both involved in scouting. And you were a youth member. I was an adult volunteer. And I still haven't got those knots figured out. Well, I don't know if you remember them.
I do, ironically, because they did feed heavily into my engineer officer training later on when I did actually end up joining the military.
So that's the trick there. You have to be using them every day. So how long were you actually involved in scouting? Oh,
that's a big question. I don't actually have the start date, but I can remember it goes back to my time when I was living in BC when I was very young, so almost like pre-K at that point. So at least 12 years. I would say at least 12 years I was involved with scouting, really culminating in 2012 when I graduated in high school. Then heading off to the Royal Military College, I intended to really keep up with it, but unfortunately just the curriculum and the commitments there precluded me from being able to really partake at that time.
Any particular event in scouting that stands out in your memory? Any particular camp you would have gone on or individual you would have met along the way?
Yeah, well, the biggest one definitely in terms of events was my ability to participate in the Canadian Jamboree in 2007. So heading down to Tamaracuda and really partaking in that 100th anniversary of scouting, I think it really opened my eyes to the organization, how spread really across not just the nation, but across the world it is, and really put that epitome of volunteer service in that first seed almost in my mind. Speaking to people that really impacted me over that time, definitely yourself, like partaking as one of those youth commissioners on the overall area commissioner for the Loyalist area in Kingston. But there's many others I could name, Mike Beausoleil, Jeff Preems, who also happens to be a very close friend and mentor, still residing in the Kingston area. People really that have been very impactful in my life, specifically when I was in Scouts and even now as I've moved into the military and really grown up.
We've talked a little bit about the fact that you went to RMC after high school. And when I talk to some high school students, they have a sense as to what they want to do when they get out of high school, and some don't have a clue. Now, was the military always something that was in the back of your mind when you were wrapping up high school?
So I remember actually since grade 7 or 8, my first real introduction to the Royal Military College. My dad, who's actually a military member himself, he had us posted to Kingston in 2006 or 7 timeframe. And I remember in September's we would go to the obstacle course. I would get to miss school and go see it. And we were constantly on a presence at the college since my dad worked at the Canadian Defence Academy at the time on the campus. Whenever there was take your kids to work day, we'd obviously go to RMC and spend the time with my dad in that regard. So I think that had a very heavy influence on me. And I could say since grade 8, I knew I was going to go to the college, and everything really that I worked for, be it, the grades in school, the community involvement afterwards, or just the implications, the networking. It was focused on actually getting into the college. So as much as I can see a lot of my peers, in high school, you're indifferent, you don't really know what you want to do from there. My goal was really to get to RMC, and at the time it was really just to get in and start from there. And I always told myself I'd figure it out after, and I guess here we are now, almost a decade later, and I'm still trying to figure it out a little bit.
Was the experience at RMC what you expected once you were there?
Not at all. And I one thing I really have to thank my father for is that he didn't try and preface it for me. He evidently having graduated himself in 1987, he had an idea of what the college life was like and how the institution works. But he shielded a lot from me because I think he wanted me to experience that for myself. Which I did. So I definitely didn't expect the experience I got, but I'm very grateful for the time I got to spend there.
Any particular experience at RMC that stands out in over the course of the 4 years?
There's honestly so many. Some really great, some not so great. Evidently, the media is very aware, and the general public, about some of the things that have been happening at the college over the past, I'd say, decade or so. And I definitely lived through a lot of those big pieces. And I remember many of those experiences very well. But the one that really still marks me is the first year orientation period, and really the lead up to the ultimate obstacle course that saw us graduate from really candidates to actual just college members. Just the teamwork that was harped upon us, and the focus, and just the regulation and regimenting of our lives over that 6-week period leading up to that. I really think that changed me, not only as making me into the beginnings of a soldier, but changed my life in terms of how I approach things and the habits and the characteristics that I now bear.
You graduated from RMC in 2016, I believe, and then you head off to Oromocto, which, for those who don't know, is a town in New Brunswick where the military has a base. And you spent some time there, and then you found yourself in Petawawa. Now, what is it that an officer would be doing during the course of a day when you are in either of those two places, or is it the same sort of thing?
Okay, so upon graduating the college, I headed off to Oromocto in New Brunswick to get on my training. So I had to do a year as a military engineering officer of training, which basically saw us develop our leadership and our planning abilities as an officer, but also go through all the technical processes and learn the different parts of the trade, because that's a big piece of being an officer. It's at least having that rudimentary understanding of what the technicians and soldiers you're leading can do. So we really go through a formation in that process. In 2017, so in May, I was posted out to Petawawa, as you mentioned, back to Ontario. And from there, I assumed a role as a troop commander, which essentially, when you really boil it down, is a manager in a lot of respects. So a lot of my day would be spent planning exercises, conducting training with my soldiers, my troops, as well as conducting human resources administration for their career development, for my own career development, as well as continuing my own formation as an officer. There's further courses that need to be continued on in that regard. And then obviously preparing for deployments, which eventually would come into play the following year after I was posted out to Petawawa.
So your degree is in chemical engineering. How much of that are you using at this stage in your career?
So one of the funny things I tell my dad quite often, because he was very adamant that I do go into engineering, and I get the iron ring, is that it took me 4 years of a degree to realize I didn't really want to be an engineer. As much that being said, I did do chemical engineering and I loved it. And ironically, the longer I've been away from it now in the math and the chemistry and whatnot, the more I miss it in a sense, and I miss the problem solving in a little regard. But the biggest piece I'd say it gave me in terms of my daily job is that background in explosives and demolitions and how chemistry and physics really works, as well as just the problem solving process that an engineer degree really provides to a person that takes it. How to really approach a problem, scope and frame the problem first, and then from there work it out in pieces so that at the end of the day it provides an overall resolution to whatever problem or conflict you might be facing.
So at this particular stage in your career, you are not using the detail of your degree. You are basically learning the skills of being a manager, being a leader.
Correct. I would say that. And as I led into my my MBA, so my Master's of Business Administration, that was a big piece as well. That first of all, the engineering degree made the math that I did on my MBA really, really easy. which I'm very thankful for in that regard. And it also had the lead up to how do we frame problems in that business world, and when we're doing analysis and whatnot, a different approach that somebody that wouldn't have an engineering background per se, more of an arts background, would approach more in a creative and much more open approach, as opposed to the very not scoped or really framed or boundaried engineer approach, but just that way that we look at it in a certain way so that we can frame the problem properly, as opposed to allowing for things like scope creep or gold plating as you go through the process.
In 2018, you were posted overseas to the Ukraine to help out. I think the program is called Unifier, where NATO was helping train soldiers in the Ukraine, correct?
Partially correct. So yes, in 2018, I headed out on Operation Unifier Rotation 5. It's a specific task force for Canada, and really it's helping the Ukrainian armed forces move towards NATO interoperability, which is a requirement for Ukraine to eventually join NATO. What I can say is that it's not actually a sanctioned or like NATO specific mission. It's very Canadian at this time. Obviously, bearing in mind that we have partners there from other nations, such as the Joint Military Training Group from the United States, that we fell within. Since I've been there, the task force has really expanded in terms of its scope and what it's been doing. But the baseline, really the underlying emphasis of it all, is helping towards that interoperability and modernizing the Ukrainian armed forces away from what it would have been at the fall of the wall, obviously, and post-Soviet era, so that it can become more of a modern, more of a Western military in that regard.
When you talk about interoperability, what are you talking about?
Interoperability is just so that the tactics, the strategies, the systems they use are in line with those of other NATO nations, so that with that standardization at the end of the day, should Ukraine ever become a part of NATO, that they can seamlessly integrate into NATO coalitions, NATO task force, NATO missions, and that there's not those problems in terms of the standardization or differentiation between the militaries and the forces at play.
Now, we are recording this particular conversation at the end of February 2022, and at this particular point, we are watching the news and listening to the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. And as a member of the Canadian Armed Forces and as someone who has had the opportunity to work with some of those folks in the Ukraine, what goes through your head as you're watching all of this news coverage?
So this is really actually an interesting topic, because it's one that I've been going over just personally with myself and speaking with peers and ex-members of the task force from my rotation over the past few days. Because at first, for me, it seemed that this was inevitable. I mean, we've been leading up to it, and I think in my current position too, overseas, which I'm sure we'll get to, we've been seeing this and planning and working towards it. But it really didn't prepare me, I think, for the fact that it happened, and there was definitely some shock involved. I think there's some disappointment. It's similar to the idea of when everything that went down in Afghanistan last August, we saw the same thing. You start to think, like, was all the work we did for naught? Did we actually make a difference there? Mm-hmm. But then as you start reaching out to people that you know there, I've spoken to a few friends and peers and whatnot in Ukraine, you start to realize, like, we did what we could and we provided the efforts in that regard. And even if we made that just a little bit better for them in that regard, that would have been worth it, I think. That was a big piece for me. And, obviously knowing that they're safe, or at least safe for the moment and time being, that's a big piece of it for me too at this time.
I guess for a whole generation of folks, myself included, who weren't around during World War II, this is something very different. I mean, we went through Afghanistan and I went through Vietnam in terms of watching the news and hearing stories about this, but the size of this particular event is a lot different in my mind than, say, Afghanistan. And so it's a little more frightening, a little more concerning, and I think that's something that the public is sort of mulling around in their mind as they watch the news and wondering where all of this is going to end up. And you have folks like you who work in this field every day, and they take more of a matter-of-fact planning approach to what goes on or what will go on going forward. Is that fair to say?
I think so. And I think a big piece of it too that differentiates it from past conflicts is just that interconnectivity and this, that, how shortened the news cycles become. I mean, the fact that anybody can really be on the ground and taking pictures and live tweeting what's going on and providing situational awareness on just what's happening actually on the ground. And that's live updated to anybody really in the world based on the platforms that we used. It does make it a little more scary, provide some depth and context to it, and makes it a little more real, as opposed to where the news cycle, would be more of a 24-hour basis back in previous conflicts, and you'd have to wait to see like images on the ground. So I guess when you really think about it, back in the day, it might have seemed more far away. It was in Europe. This is a Europe context, but now it almost feels like it's happening, next door, like just
Right.
whatever amount of kilometers away. And when you include and consider just the polarization of everything going on, back home in Canada, as well as down south in the United States, and just everywhere really with the conflicts and stuff, it just puts things into perspective that there's definitely stuff going on right now. I'm not saying that it would be like more or less compared to what it would have been in previous decades, but it definitely hasn't changed.
Yeah, you hear more about it more often. Yeah. Let's get back to you and your travels. So after you did your posting in the Ukraine, you came back to Petawawa, and there was a particular incident there that triggered a desire to get back involved in the community, and that's the flood relief that the military was called upon to help with in the Ottawa area. And what was it about that particular event that sort of twigged something in your brain about community involvement?
So really, since leaving the college, I had told myself I'd get back involved in the community because it was such a big part before I went to RMC through Scouts and whatnot and all the other stuff. And in that regard, it just got so busy with a year on training and then being in Petawawa, working up for deployment, doing the deployment, coming back, being busy again, that I just didn't find the time really. But I kept telling myself, like, when I find time, I'm going to do this. So when I was called upon in April 2019 to go provide flood assistance as part of Operation Lentis in the National Capital Region, just seeing the community, how it came together in different areas of Ottawa, such as like in Constance Bay in Britannia, seeing OC transport buses coming down from wherever it might be and just dropping off like hundreds of volunteers that were just there to fill sandbags and take direction and help fight the floods for their city. That reminded me of how important really community service was, and how amidst all this polarization and everything going on in society, that really the bedrock is founded in the community and the municipalities, and it's something that I wanted to be a big part of and really renew. So in that regard, I reached out to a couple organizations, knowing I was posted out to New Brunswick, and I was happy to really start pursuing that as soon as I got into New Brunswick. In my off hours. While I wasn't working, particularly also considering at the time, that my wife-to-be stayed in Ottawa completing her master's. So I had a lot of free evenings and a lot of free time to work through that on my own.
So you moved to New Brunswick and you start to instruct as part of your daily job. And I have a question. So you are the leader of a squadron or whatever group you are in charge of as an officer. Does an officer automatically become a good instructor, or is that a skill that you have to develop in addition to the ability to lead?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest things that makes an instructor really, the word good, I don't think is enough to really underline it, but like an instructor, make them not even relevant, but just able and great almost, is that they want to. It's the wanting, right? Yeah. So anybody can really, read a PowerPoint, give a lecture, what it might be, but it's, providing that extra experience that they might have from their own background, doing that extra research prior to giving whatever lesson they might be giving, and really just wanting to see that growth, or at least the seed of growth, take hold in the students or the people they're instructing. That's a big piece, I think, in being a great instructor, above and beyond just giving the lecture, right? And I definitely did have a privilege going in as the basic training list manager for the Canadian Military Engineering School once I arrived in 2019, because essentially I would be the first officer that they would meet as the new students coming in fresh off their basic training. So for that, I was really that introduction to the engineer corps for a lot of people. And I took that to heart because I really wanted them to know what such a great experience lay ahead of them, particularly considering how fortunate I had been in my own experience in the 2 years prior to that when I was at the school myself as a candidate.
Now, at this particular point, we are about 4 years out from RMC, and you have been working on your MBA through the University of Fredericton, as I understand it. And your MBA is Business Administration. Why that particular discipline? Was it because you had to find something in that area that really interested you?
So the MBA, honestly, to bring it all back, I started it when I was in Ottawa, and I was fortunate enough because it's virtual learning, because University of Fredericton actually does their degrees via virtual learning online. Before it was cool in a sense because of the pandemic. But I was fortunate to be able to do it while I was deployed as well. And I wrapped it up in May of 2020 when I was in New Brunswick. And I think the reason I picked that is because I wanted to get away specifically from engineering in itself, because I wanted to spread it around and really have that generalist approach. So looking at different disciplines and being able to just spread my skills and my knowledge in that regard, as well as because the business administration piece in that master's scope, it is heavily about leadership and management of resources, be it personnel, be it financial resources, be it equipment, whatever it might be, and that provided a basis. And finally, I think the big piece too is that we really did a delve into systems thinking approach and looking at systems and systems of systems, which fed into that whole engineering process and problem solving context. And I think melded with that, so the engineering background and now with that, the management background for administration, together, I think it's really a two-pronged approach, and it gives you different outlooks on problems that some might not be able to be resolved from the engineer method. Maybe on the other side of the hand with the business administration, it's easier to look at it and take that approach.
As far as community involvement goes, you decided to get involved with firefighting and working with St. John's Ambulance, and you seem to have spent a lot of time with that particular organization, working in different areas. What was it about that particular organization that interested you?
So for St. John's Ambulance, I was so fortunate to come on board with that. So that was as soon as I arrived, it's about September 2019, I did my interviews, went through orientation, and that was a ground up piece. So for me now, having come back to the school as an instructor, I wanted to find different outlets that would also provide me that catharsis in a sense of, not being always in charge and having to be the person that's like managing people. So I said to myself, I'm going to find some things that allow me to just be led, be a follower, because part of being a leader is being a good follower first. So for that, I had to work my way up and start with the basic first aid, the medical first responder courses, and then I would be doing community services as part of the divisions that they call them in St. John's Ambulance. So we would go to community events such as hockey games, Terry Fox runs, local events, be they whatever. And from there, we would essentially just provide standby first aid and medical provisional services, and that really allowed me to interact with the community. Unfortunately, it wasn't Fredericton or Ormocto at the time. I was driving about an hour down to St. John every time I was there to interact, but it made it worth it. I was doing it with people that I was meeting and making friends, some of which I'm still very close to, and I think will be those lifelong kind of friends in terms of that development. And as I became more and more involved with St. John's Ambulance, more and more opportunities opened up to themselves. I became an instructor for mental health first aid and mental health wellness. Something that I've been very fortunate to be able to continue as we've moved to the virtual domain and providing that. And since I've been posted where I currently am, I'm still providing those mental health first aid courses via distance learning. So that's been a big piece for me as well. Is really just my ability to expand and grow within that organization, but also still being very involved with the community and making that difference, because you get to really experience, and speak with the people.
The pandemic has forced us all to learn how to use the virtual world a lot more than we ever had before. And I'm wondering, as an instructor, what kind of extra skills do you have to employ to make virtual learning as impactful as in-person learning?
Definitely, I think a love of learning and a love of lifelong growth is a big piece for a virtual instructor. Because as much as in a classroom, you can kind of get by just providing your lecture, reading off your PowerPoint. If you do that in virtual learning, specifically with the cameras turned off so that you save bandwidth, you're not going to be instructing very well for long. So in that regard, really just providing that pizzazz, really getting the oomph into the presentations and the lectures you're making, as well as opening up the learning experience into more discussions and workshops as opposed to just straight lectures. And that's a big piece that the mental health wellness in the workplace workshop is that it opens it up for discussion and allows people to provide their own experiences and speak to how they can relate the material that you're reviewing as a group to how it might apply to their own lives. So that in fact, every time I provide one of these sessions or these workshops, I find myself learning as well new skills, be it to cope, with stress or burnout or whatnot, or just how to approach difficult situations where somebody might be identified as having a mental health injury that you want to help with.
In our calendar, we've reached the summer of 2021, and you are now being posted to Izmir, Turkey. And I'm wondering, in your particular career, whether you've had the choice to go to a certain area or whether you just are told that this is where you're going.
Oh, that's a very big question. And I know a lot of people are going to be listening to the podcast that are going to pay attention to what I answer here. So what I'll say is, there's options in certain senses that you can you can say where you'd like to go, but at the end of the day, the engineer corps is gonna, or even just the military in general, is gonna balance the needs of the individuals with the needs of the organization and the institution. So at the time, the need for in 2019, I was looking at actually going to Ottawa, and I ended up being told it would be preferred if I went to New Brunswick, and I happily jumped on that and went to be an instructor, which I think really set the foundations for the offer for a posting that came for Turkey in 2021. In that regard, I was very strongly advocating at the time that I wanted to go back on operational deployment, go overseas and work, be it in the Middle East or in Eastern Europe. And the retort I received from one of my supervisors at the time was, well, instead of a deployment there, how would you feel about going to work with NATO and in this headquarters context? And of course, at that time, I knew that I had kind of put my cards and become, in a poker term, pot committed in a sense, because if I said no to that, but I was asking for a deployment, it wouldn't really reflect well on my character or what my desires or intent was. So I jumped on it, and I'm much better for it. I've definitely learned an incredible amount since I've been here. So as much as we do have a say in where we're going, it's definitely managed closely at the higher levels. And so far, 1, 2, 3 postings since my training, I can say that where I've been sent, whoever decided to send me there has been right 3 times out of 3.
I think a lot of people didn't even know that there was a base in Turkey that Canadians were posted to. So this is a NATO base we're talking about, correct?
This is correct. So Allied Land Command is a 3-star headquarters, essentially, that is the land domain advocate for the entire alliance for NATO. So it's a multinational headquarters. There's members from all different countries within NATO, and Canada, of course, has its own presence in terms of staff officers that are provided to the headquarters in a rotationary sense, and where we seamlessly integrate with the other nations within the different technical divisions, and from there we provide our expertise and work in that headquarters context.
We've talked a little bit about this whole business of integration and everyone who is a member of the alliance approaching things in a similar fashion. As far as an instructor goes, so if you are doing instructing in Turkey, is it more difficult? Do we have a language barrier that you have to get across, given the fact that many of the nations aren't necessarily speaking English all the time?
So I personally thought coming over, language was going to be the largest barrier. And to my surprise, it was not. Because with the interconnectivity, social media, and our tools we have, with instantaneous translations on Google Translate, it's not actually a barrier at all in many respects. It's the cultural barrier that really becomes the one that we have to overcome. And I think that the different cultures, with members from Eastern Europe, members from, continental Europe and whatnot, and members from, the UK, Canada, the United States, we all have different approaches to how we solve problems and even how we have our own working routines. And sometimes there can be frictions that arise from the way we approach these problems or the way we see conflict resolution, or even just in the greater strategical political sense in terms of what we think our countries might want and what our commitments are in that regard. But I can say that we do overcome them and we work together as teams, because as much as it might be about the overarching political sphere, at the end of the day, it's individuals, like I was saying, at those community levels that make the bedrock and the foundation for that. And ideally, everyone wants to get along, so we strive very hard to make it work and be together and do the business the best way we can.
What is it that you're doing in Turkey, you personally, at this point?
So personally, I work as essentially a coordination manager for the engineering division within the headquarters. So it's a lot of schedule coordination, synchronization of calendars and whatnot, information knowledge management, and essentially whatever my boss needs. So I act as an assistant in that regard to the head of the engineering directorate or division. And I fix things, basically. That's the biggest way to put it.
So in the business world, what would be a counterpart to what you're doing now?
So it's one of the big pieces, I think, and one of the difficulties is translating, I think, military-specific employment to the civilian world, because a lot of different roles fall under what I'm doing as a coordination manager now. So there's an operations manager piece to it. There's an information knowledge officer management piece to it. There's human resources. I also manage the budget for the division, so there's financial management in that respect. So I don't think I would pinpoint a specific civilian employment type role, but like I said, it comes back to that whole idea of generalism. In that method, I'm a generalist with the engineering background, the MBA. It provides me a very wide array of skills that I haven't necessarily mastered all specifically in a specialist method, but that allows me to partake and really address any conflict or issue that might be coming up and take it from there.
Let me switch gears a little bit on you and talk about postings. So when you were growing up and you were with your dad and the rest of your family, I would imagine that your dad was posted here, there, and everywhere in his career. And now you are getting posted here, there, and everywhere. And I'm wondering what the difference is between being posted as a kid and being posted as an adult.
The frustrations are different. They're still there, but they're different. So when I was younger and as a kid, we were posted out to BC when I was very young, and then we were posted back to Quebec from BC, and we did it by car. So the frustrations as a kid, obviously, going away, leaving my friends, changing schools, having to integrate again to a new community. And then the biggest frustration as a kid in the car was trying to pick what game I wanted to play on my Game Boy and making sure my brother wasn't playing it beside me at the same time. So that was the biggest frustration then. Now as an adult, it's really, you start learning, you start seeing the different pieces. So it's how do I manage my taxes being in different provinces, canceling all the bills I might have or the subscriptions and having to move them over to a new province, finding out what the mechanics of the province are, Ontario versus New Brunswick in that regard. Going through as now an adult, I guess you could say, like buying my first house. Deciding if I was going to sell it or rent it out in that regard. So I think when I really look at it, the frustrations, they're very different. They're different in scope, they're different in gravity, but they're still there. When you really boil it down, the emphasis is on change. It's the fact that you're in a changing environment, be it whatever you're approaching in that regard. And there's always going to be resistance to change in the fact that, as a species, we don't necessarily like change. It's not comfortable. But as you do it more and more often, and as you become accustomed to it, and as you expect it, because you can expect to be posted every few years in a military context, you get a little more comfortable with it, and you start to develop systems or checklists in a sense that allow you to make it easier in that regard. So for me, having gone from Ontario to New Brunswick, back to Ontario, back to New Brunswick, it became easier every time I did it, and I got better, and like that growing pain period definitely shortened up. Now, then with the curveball of going overseas, that added a lot of extra checklists, a lot of extra requirements. And now having gotten through that and I guess settling in as we are 225 days into this deployment so far, I could say we're finally comfortable. But the answer and really follow-up to that will be we will see once we return home to Canada how that goes.
Now, are you living on the base in Turkey or are you living off base?
We're off base. We are living on the economy in Turkey, and it's great. I can say honestly that I'm loving the country so far and what it has to offer. Because
it's a very different cultural atmosphere, I would guess, in Turkey than some of the other places you've been.
It is, and I think I mentioned earlier that the culture has definitely been a barrier. But in some respects, it's also what made it so attractive, getting to seamlessly, at least attempt to seamlessly integrate into society here and really the culture. It's been a big piece. It's definitely had its frustrations, both for myself and my wife. And as we move forward, I think, we've had our ups and downs. But these are things I think that we'll look back on. We'll have stories about what we've seen here, and it'll provide not just introspection, but also retrospective capacities on what we look back on how things were here in Turkey versus what I'm coming back to home in Canada, whenever that may be. So in that regard, I hope that I'll grow from that, and that I'll be able to bring back some good things from here that maybe could be relevant or bettering for Canadian society, or in whatever scope that I'll be able to apply it as a member of a community. But also, make me more grateful for things that we have back in Canada that necessarily they don't have out here in Turkey.
When I was looking around to think about people to have a conversation with, I was rummaging through my LinkedIn postings, and I saw your name several times popping up in reaction to articles that other people had written, or indicating that you had written articles. And that intrigued me to a certain extent because I didn't know that about you in terms of the writing aspect. And you've written articles for various publications. Is that something that you've always done, the writing part of it? Is it something that's evolved from your career so far?
So this is a bit of a long-winded story, but without getting too much into it, the long story short is I've really always loved writing. And going into the engineering background, I had to give that up a little bit because it's a very heavy curriculum in university. A lot of people that don't know me in depth don't know that in high school I pursued in my off time a lot of different courses such as psychology, philosophy, and in grade 12 I did a writer's craft course because it was very big to me at the time. I wrote a lot of fiction on my own time and short stories and whatnot, but it never really materialized. And now really graduating and getting into the MBA, obviously, in that time, there's papers that have to be written, and we start looking at different topics such as leadership and business analysis and what the markets are doing, going up, going down, whatever it might be. And I wrote a little bit about that for school, and I would submit those papers, and that's where it ended. I think it was last year I really did my first real peer-edited publication when a friend of mine, who as part of his current master's degree, was actually published in an article in the Royal Canadian Military Institute, their journal SITREP. And in there, he asked if I wanted to partake in an article with him in that regard. And from there, it just grew. I was reached out to with the Atlantic Forum, which is a youth NATO organization in that regard. I've worked now with the Canadian Journal of Emergency Management. And I realized that, based on my experiences, I've got some things to say, I think, and I can add some value in terms of my experience and what I've seen that others might benefit from in terms of the academic material. The question is really just getting it on the paper, putting it in a proper structure people can understand, and ensuring that I don't have run-on sentences that last 2 pages, which I'm prone to do. So in that regard, I'm very grateful to my friend that brought me on board with that. And I think it's something that's going to be a very big piece of me moving forward, really foundational in my approach. And I could see it really, if I ever did change careers, I think, not necessarily policy writing, but writing in general could be something that I look at moving forward. It's something I really do truly enjoy. And that's not something I want to easily give up in the next little while.
One of the things I've been interested in is that I have a stereotypical vision of an officer in the military. And it's not based on any real assessment by reading something. It's just a vision I have that, the top guys tell the lower guys what to do. And there's usually not too much pushback from the lower guys. So my sense is that some of the articles I've written, I know there was, I think it's somebody who was also posted to Turkey but is an American, and it sounds like he's higher up the rank than you are, and he wrote an article and you were commenting on his article, and it's like I don't know what his rank is and I don't know what your rank is, but I'm thinking that your rank is lower than his. And this business of the give and take between lower ranks and higher ranks, is that something that has changed in the military, or has that always been there and we just didn't know about it, the give and take?
It's always definitely been there in some regard, but it has evolved drastically over the past few decades, the past few years, the past few centuries. Gone are the days where you can really just show up and buy a commission. What it was, many hundred years ago, when it was really class-based. And as society develops, we have soldiers that are not officers that have degrees and have background education. So it's no longer a case of just being able to tell soldiers to go do a task and it being because I said so. You get into a situation where you have to really explain the why and provide them that intent, that background, the scheme of maneuver, and really the meat of the product, so that there's an understanding. And when you understand too, and you look at that whole idea of mission command, which is really enabling your subordinate commanders and your subordinates to do the mission, and understanding as well that they might, become leaders one day themselves, you really become motivated to do this. So as an officer, that's a big piece, I think, of that leadership, is one, being a good follower and, trying to understand the intent of the directives that are being given to you. And on the same token, in that give and take, scope that you mentioned, as a leader, providing that intent, providing that background, and speaking to why we're doing what we're doing, so that there's an understanding. And it provides even an innate motivation to do things. When you have a better understanding of why you're being told to do a specific task, and what it plays in that whole grand scheme of things, I think it does create more innate motivation in a person to pursue that task and do it to the best of their abilities, and really strive for that excellence, because you have that larger understanding of where it plays its part in the bigger picture.
I think it doesn't matter what business you are in or what career you have, the three most important components of success are communication, communication, communication. And I've always believed that, and you've basically just said that we all have to communicate much better with each other, top down and bottom up. That would, fair assessment that you would agree with?
I would definitely agree with that. And to proclaim that, I've always been an over communicator, so at least I like to think I'm doing a little bit of that right. And I'm always encouraging others to communicate. And if they have something to say, be it of a lower rank or a higher rank, please voice it, because it's only through communication that we're going to be able to discover if there's any actual issues or problems, and then address those problems. A problem that's not being addressed just grows into a bigger problem.
Now, are you intending on making the military your lifelong career, or do you see yourself moving on to something else at some point?
That is a very big question. I honestly don't know. I can't provide an answer. There's ebbs and flows. There's some days where I'm definitely telling myself, I'll be in this till I'll just work until I die, essentially, and continue with the career. And when I was younger, and definitely the earlier stages of when I joined the military, I was telling myself and very convinced that I would be in the military, as an entire career. But as things progress, I don't think that it's necessarily that I've, grown disillusioned or I'm growing away from the military, but I'm looking at other things and other options. And I think the question at the end of the day is going to become one of where can I maximize, my value, my experience in giving back to, society, my community I'm in, and the organization I work for. So I think it'll just be a question of looking at whatever next posting's offered to me, what the next positions are, evaluating what the options around that continue being, and obviously looking at geography a little bit. I would like to come back to Kingston at some point in my life and, be a little closer to family in some regard.
Now, community involvement, where do you see yourself going with that? How important is that to you?
It's been a big question for me really since graduating the college. So earlier in the conversation, I think we talked about how important RMC was and getting there. And once I got into RMC, a big question I had to ask myself was, what now? And I started telling myself, well, the next step. And, as I developed, my own background, as I had experiences and I just, experienced life as we went on, things start growing on you, certain themes and certain motives stick with you. And for me, community service has become really a bedrock of what I want to do. It's definitely foundational. And I think it will be my inherent motivation outside of my family, to do whatever it ends up being that I pursue, be it, career-wise, volunteer-wise, or even hobby-wise. It's being with people, interacting with them, and making, the communal concept and the collectivity better in that respect that'll, I think, will motivate me moving forward. So I'll definitely keep playing a part in St. John's Ambulance. Other organizations that pop up, I'm not sure. I've previously been involved with the Alumni Association for both the college, Royal Military College, and both, providing orientations to new students for University of Fredericton. But again, it's about leveraging opportunities that come as they come, and making the impact where I can.
And something tells me you will make an impact. Listen, Alex, thanks very much for your time today. Thank you for your service, and stay safe. I very much enjoyed our conversation today.
So very much appreciated. Anytime, I'm glad to partake.
Our thanks once again to our guest in this episode, Alexander Landry. Alex joined us from his home in Turkey, and the conversation was recorded in late February 2022.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the kingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.